Welcome, everyone. Great to see you. We're going to give it another minute while other folks are joining. Thanks so much for taking the time. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Shabana, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Great. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Um, just as a preliminary housekeeping details, please note that we are recording this session, and we invite you to please list your names, organizations, and respective countries in the chat so that we can keep account. And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Shobana Sosle. I'm a staff member of the World Bank Group, working with the Education and Skills Department. And I am also a member of the Building Evidence for Education, that is BE Squared working group, which is a working group of organizations committed to education evidence and research production and use, including bilateral donors, multilateral agencies, philanthropic organizations, and global and regional networks. This now includes over 40 institutions. We do this by holding regular meetings, putting on trainings and workshops, supporting special interest groups, and producing public goods, such as the new working paper that will be presented today. We encourage you to go to our website that is posted in the chat to see our resources. And again, we welcome you all. This morning, the moderator for today's session will be Dr. Madiha Khan. Dr. Khan is Director of Consulting Services at Educate Venture Research. She is an AI researcher, data scientist, and was part of the AI working group that provided direction to the development of this paper. So over to you, Dr. Khan, and welcome again, everybody.
Thank you so much, Shabana. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to see you all here today. Really looking forward to the conversation that we promised to have today. As Shabana said, I was lucky enough to be part of the working group that worked on this paper. Really enjoyed the exercise. And I would encourage you all to go and download the paper now. It is available at that link, which has just been put into the chat now. So do go and download it, start to have a look through. Some really interesting insights within that paper. So the focus for today is, as per the paper, on how AI can support secondary research in education, as well as evidence uptake and use. So secondary research, as you know, that includes things such as finding, summarizing, extracting, synthesizing the use of evidence and communicating that to others as well in accessible ways. We're looking both at evidence synthesis, but also at evidence uptake. So how are we encouraging others, funders, intermediaries, regulators to engage with that evidence and make the most use of it within their practice? And our context very much is low and middle income countries, LMICs, and that is central. The reason it's central is partly because, as we're aware, AI is an amplifier. And so some of the long-standing structural issues that we know exist already in relation to bias, powers, asymmetries, those are amplified through the potential introduction of AI into these systems. But the flip side, the balance is that actually AI can also offer great opportunities for improving access, improving adoption of evidence, and engagement with evidence. So that is the reason we're exploring the use of AI within secondary research for these contexts. And so what we'd like to do within this hour that we have together is present the working paper and the key messages within this working paper, as well as examples of use cases that we came across. We have a fantastic panel and discuss it with us, and we'd like to hear from them on their own experiences in relation to evidence synthesis and also uptake of evidence within their contexts, the lessons they've learned, and what the implications of those lessons really are for all of us to consider, and present a framework for how AI can be adopted within this context, for this use case in a responsible way. So before we do that, we'd like to have a quick poll just to learn a little bit more about the audience. And so I think there should be a poll that comes up on your screens, which you'll be able to answer. And our question is, where is you or your organization currently in using AI for evidence synthesis or for evidence uptake? And we've already got some answers coming through, which is fantastic. And it is fairly mixed at the moment. I'll give it a minute before we have all the answers come through. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So you can see that it's a mix. It's very diverse, which chimes with our own experiences within this area. So some of you aren't using AI for this as yet, while others have perhaps started to explore the use of it. Some are piloting the use of AI, perhaps starting to monitor the impact of the use of AI for this. And it would be very interesting for you to think about, what are you really seeing in terms of impact? What are your reflections on the implementation of this use? And for those of you who are using it routinely, again, just hearing some of your reflections in the Q&A at the end would be really, really interesting for us. And developing policy, procurement guidance, or governance, that seems to be quite low, actually, at 8%. So again, that's super interesting, because there is such a need to be thinking about what safe use looks like in this area as well as others. And so do we really have the processes in place to enable that safe use? So now, thank you for doing that poll. Now I'd like to introduce you to Deborah Greben. So Deborah is the Deputy Lead for Building Evidence in Education, and she's also the author of this working paper. She previously worked on the evidence team of the USAID Center for Education, and she now consults on education research, evidence, and AI. Over to you, Deborah.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. I am delighted that we are launching this new BE Squared working paper, and I'd like to give you a quick overview of it. So the overall framework for this paper is that AI is reshaping the evidence ecosystem. We know it's reshaping lots of industries. It is reshaping how learning happens in the classroom. It's also reshaping how evidence is produced, how it's translated, and how it's used. There are obviously lots of benefits that we'll talk about. There are also significant risks, but that really, in terms of how it's reshaping this whole process, it's also reshaping relationships. It's reshaping power, and that means it can strengthen those ecosystems. It can also distort them. This paper was a group effort. Although I'm the primary author, we put together an AI working group of AI experts who are listed on the screen, who had input and gave feedback to the whole process. We also had our steering committee members who are listed here, who were all an important part of this paper. We had research support from Cara Taylor with Mannion Daniels, and then a number of reviewers and other folks from the BE Squared community that gave feedback as well. This paper, this paper was also in terms of, it's an analytical overview, but it was also an AI assisted overview. So we did use AI in the production of this paper. We used Google Scholar and Eric to target searches for different key terms. And then we actually used AI to search for additional sources, as well as to develop a first draft. In hindsight, I'm not sure we would have done that again, given that it created actually a lot of extra work. But we then had to go through and verify all the claims, citations. We went through multiple rounds of feedback from experts. We interviewed experts. So there were a lot of different inputs into this paper. The opportunities that we see here in this space around evidence synthesis and use are, first of all, automation and acceleration of the process. It can speed things up, and it can also help to save time on human labor. It can also potentially reduce the cost. But it also has the potential to augment our insight as well, to help us look across vast bodies of research and find gaps as well as cluster themes. And then it also has the ability to help us democratize the process. It can lower technical barriers, but it can also help us with the localization or the contextualization of this, helping us to translate into new languages and promote access. So just to quickly go over some of the uses in the evidence synthesis space. One of these is around what I just mentioned, evidence mapping or gap analysis. This is using techniques like topic modeling and clustering. These are really interested and covered briefly in the paper. Additionally, we talk about the whole process of evidence synthesis. So some of the steps are listed here. AI can definitely help with some of these steps more than others. And in fact, if you are interested, we will be putting on a training on this topic around some of the different steps in evidence synthesis next week. And we'll put a link to the registration form for that training if you're interested into the chat. But there are real key challenges in this process because AI can overweight English language studies. It can underrepresent local evidence from LMICs. And it also can't access research that's behind paywalls or that it doesn't have access to. In addition, there are also processing problems. So even if it has access to the right data, it might retrieve the wrong information from those. It might interpret findings incorrectly. So there are a lot of challenges still in this space. And what that means for the risks in using this is that there's a risk to evidence integrity because AI can invent details or misread studies. There is a risk around reproducibility because you can ask the same question to the same system and get a different answer. And third is bias and exclusion, especially when the underlying evidence base is already skewed. Tools can amplify what's most visible, what's most published, what's most easily indexed. There's methodological distortion because AI can oversimplify designs or flatten context. And then there's also the human side of this, where AI can potentially erode human skills if we're outsourcing a lot of our thinking. It can also, there are also governance risks around privacy, around intellectual property, around what happens to the different inputs into these systems. So that's around evidence synthesis, but this paper also covered evidence uptake. So a few of the uses that we cover in the paper are around automated policy briefs, which is potentially a high risk use if you're using it for kind of directly getting information into the hands of decision makers. We highlight an example in the paper around JPAL that's using this using AI and multi-agent process for first draft policy briefs with lots of human input thereafter. We also highlight multilingual translation which can expand access, but quality definitely varies by language. So you need to know when the translation is good enough for your particular purpose. And then we also highlight these conversational interfaces where chatbots can let someone query the research in their own language, which has the potential to increase access, also has the potential for harms if there are these issues around evidence synthesis and incorrect information that's coming through these systems. So the important point here is that trust in this research and these different uses of AI requires verification. So if you can't trace a claim back to its source and verify it, then it should not be used to shape decisions. So some of the quality assurance measures that are taken for this, first and foremost, having humans verifying throughout the process. Also benchmarking and context validation. So if you want to know how a tool is performing on the kinds of documents and context that you're working with, then you need that sort of context relevant validation, as well as comparing it to global benchmarks. There's also bias and fairness audits, and then we really emphasize in the paper as well documentation. What models are you using? What prompts? What workflows? What are the limitations? The paper argues that we need an ecosystem building strategy because AI will affect infrastructure, it's going to affect governance, incentives, who holds power. So we need a coordinated approach, especially in LMIC context where there are capacity constraints, there are equity risks that are very real. So the paper ends with 5 principles for responsible AI use. These principles were designed primarily for BE Squared members, most of whom are funders, but these principles apply more broadly as well. So I'll cover these very quickly. The first principle is investing in sustainable public infrastructure. That includes open source tools that lower the barriers to entry so that local organizations can adopt and adapt them. That also means developing and investing in representative data sets, because if AI is trained mostly on global north contexts, then it will reflect those assumptions. So we need data and evidence from across LMIC contexts, and we need that to be more visible and usable. And then for those that are funding research or funding these tools, it's important that your procurement processes are again, prioritizing these open standards, as well as co-design with local partners. The second principle is around data privacy and security. This is a no-brainer, but it's not easy always. That means limiting AI to non-sensitive public documents, establishing clear protocols, checking privacy settings. The third principle is around governing early and proactively. So I think that's interesting that a lot of folks aren't yet working, that are on this call at least, aren't yet working on the governance piece. But that governance piece is really important. That means establishing clear policies and ethical guidelines. That means that during implementation, you have good human oversight. So you can be explicit about what tasks should be automated, what should not. And then that also means that governance is a continuous process that ensures that inclusive decision-making. And then there's critical learning and adaptation. That means building AI literacy, everyone from researchers and users to policymakers. That means transparency, as I mentioned earlier about disclosing the models that you're using, the data sources, prompts. And that also means a real commitment to evaluation and iteration. So doing that both as independent evaluation, but also being honest about your own experiences with this and sharing as you're learning day to day. And finally, there's strengthening LMIC leadership and capacity. In order to strengthen that leadership and capacity, we need to make sure that LMIC leaders and researchers are the creators of their own solutions, that we're broadening AI literacy, and that we're supporting the development of technical skills so that we can have more contextually relevant solutions and local innovation. And then my final slide here is just to mention that at the very end of this document, we've included key questions for ecosystem actors, meaning that the paper lists different questions that we should ask ourselves, some that apply to all of us, others that apply to funders, some to researchers, others to ministry staff or those working on them. So I encourage you to look at those questions and consider them for yourself and for your organization. So I will now hand the mic back over to Madiha. That's the overview. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah, for that overview. That's brilliant. And let me let me bring Dr. Ezequiel Molina into the discussion. So Dr. Molina is a senior economist in the World Bank's Education Global Practice for Latin America, with a focus on teachers and educational technology. He is an AI champion and advises colleagues on applying AI tools, overseeing pilot projects, exploring AI in educational settings. So Dr. Molina, it's great to have you, and I'd love to hear your reflections on the paper, but also more broadly on AI in this area of secondary research.
Thanks, Madina, and thanks, Deborah, and congratulate Deborah and the team for this very important work. As we saw in the answers to the poll earlier, there is a lot of piloting or use it informally. And having this work helps out have a common language to talk about this, to think about this process of how to do it in the best possible way. I think the paper does an amazing job on a very difficult and fast-moving landscape. I want to emphasize 3 points that are featured in the papers, but I think are important to reflect. The first point for me is that the product has changed. What we call evidence synthesis in 2026 is not the same product as it was 2 years ago. There is a tempting narrative that AI has made evidence synthesis cheaper, and I would push back. What was the old product of the evidence, a static PDF published once and never updated, has become cheaper. But that is not longer the product that we need. The static PDF engaged few policymakers, not many. It was too late for most, and become something that you check if there is one already available. But I would say very few countries would use it on demand, meaning I want to know something, let's run a systematic review to find out what's the best evidence on this particular topic. We often ignore this because there wasn't any alternative. And I think now we have a great opportunity for evidence review. A useful evidence synthesis should be interactive, should allow users to query by context and compare intervention. It should be multilingual. It should be available in the language that policy makers and practitioners actually use. It should be a living document or a living interaction, updating automatically as new studies are published, or with some workflow that has a human in the loop. It should be fully documented with workflows that are transparent enough to replicate. And it should be accessible through interfaces that work in low bandwidth environment. As you can think, that's not a cheaper product. That's a fundamentally different product with higher upfront investment and ongoing maintenance cost, but dramatically higher value and reach. The risk is that we use AI to produce more of the old product faster, flooding the field with a static PDF that nobody reads, rather than investing in the infrastructure that we need for this new product. The second point that I want to discuss, the paper discusses AI performance and different workflows. I want to propose something concrete that is, and I think Deborah was pointing to that, that B Square could establish benchmark comparing workflows across configurations. And I know that Deborah emphasized this, and we have a discussion before this of whether one should even think about having an evidence review that is just done by AI. But I actually would run evidence review that we can automatize everything that we can by AI, then AI and the human in the loop, and then only humans. And let's just measure accuracy, cost, time, type of errors. Let's run this comparison, document carefully, repeat in 12 months, 24 months, beyond. Why? Because the optimal workflow is not fixed. AI capabilities improve rapidly. A configuration that is unreliable today may outperform human next years. A task requiring heavy human oversight may not need only some spot checking in 18 months. Without systematic measuring over time, we are making investment decisions blind. And this also identifies where human input has the highest marginal value. Maybe humans add little to abstract screening, but are essential for processing the context. Maybe machine translation work for Spanish, but not for Quechua. We need data to know where to allocate the effort efficiently. And among all of us, we produce enough synthesis to generate this evidence. As Deborah was saying, if we coordinate our work, we can definitely create a public good for the entire field. And my final point is that on using AI, there is an issue that is a basic methodological challenge that we have. That is that we put the same prompt into AI twice and we get different outputs. We use different models, we get different output. This is fundamentally unlike any other research tool we used before. In the calculator, it gives you the same answer every time. AI does not. And this has implication. If an AI-assisted screening process isn't replicable, what does it mean for the review validity? If we run the same extraction tomorrow, would we get different effect sizes? And I think I also don't want to romanticize the human in the loop, because the human in the loop also makes errors in the same way as AI. It's not clear that you said I have a human, then all the potential mistakes AI is going to make, the human is going to solve it. It's all of this is about trade-off, and we need to think what are the trade-offs that we're interested in going through. So we need protocols. For example, to require multiple runs of the same task and compare output. Should we use several models in parallel and look for convergence? When output diverge, what is the decision rule? Does consensus across models increase reliability or just mask shared biases? I think all of these are important things and important discussions where B Square can add a lot of value. So to close, I think that the paper gives us a very strong foundation. And I think it would be great to see B Square leading in defining what new evidence synthesis product look like, generating comparative workflow data over time, and establishing protocols to use with these tools that could help researchers and practitioners alike. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I made a lot of notes while you were speaking there because I was just so interested in it. But I'm just going to quickly say a couple of things before we then move on to the panel. And I think for me, what struck me was in the beginning, you were talking about how we can't just do more of the same, essentially, right? It was fundamentally the nature of, secondary research changes when we start thinking about the use of AI within secondary research. We need to iterate how we're using it, iterate our evaluations of the use of AI within this field. And at the end, you talked about how the role of the human within all of this, right? What does that look like? And I suppose one question for me, which I'm going to continue to think about, will be around what are the skills that people and researchers need as they engage with AI, right? So what does the human AI model actually start to look like? And what are the skills that people need? What are the new competencies that we need? Because as you're saying, it's not just another research tool. It's fundamentally different. Thank you so much for that. Super interesting. And now I'd like to move on to the panel, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. So we're lucky to have John and Srihari with us here. So Jonathan Kay is the head of evidence synthesis and international at the Education Endowment Foundation. He is responsible for the evidence synthesis work at EEF, including teaching and learning toolkit and guidance reports. He's also a board member of the Campbell Collaboration, which produces and disseminates systematic reviews on the effects of interventions, including in the field of education. And then we have Dr. Srihari Ravindranath, who is a psychologist and educator specializing in social and emotional learning and well-being. He was previously an academic, and he now works with Dream a Dream, which is a nonprofit that focuses on empowering young people through life skills and SEL. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to start with John, if I may, with a few questions for John. So John, I would first of all love to learn about your own experience and insights within this field of AI for secondary research, evidence synthesis, and then learn about your key takeaways within this use case, given your experience as well.
Yeah, thanks. And as you said in my introduction, at the Education Endowment Foundation, we do evidence synthesis to support practitioners, policymakers, and school leaders in having access to the evidence in a way that can support them with their professional decision making. And probably our most well-known tool is a tool called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which aims to provide that accessible summary. But it takes a lot of work to produce. So underpinning the toolkit are around 5,000 studies in 30 different systematic reviews. We have a lot of very tired research assistants that spend day and night coding, screening, extracting data from studies. And so for us, AI offers a real opportunity not to make all of those RAs redundant and contribute to those human capital costs, but actually to think about how can we use people on the things that are really hard, that the evidence translation, the mobilization, the making sure that findings are targeted and used by practice and policy. And I think our key reflection in the space as we've piloted actually really reflects a lot of what's been said so far. So it's all about balancing those risks and rewards. And we know that the toolkit is going to need to be living in order to respond to the competition, which is no longer static articles in journals, but is people asking an LLM to summarize the evidence. And so we're going through a process of piloting different stages of the review process and trying to work out what is most effective, where are their cost savings, and where is it supporting the usability of the tool. I think the thing that it's bad at still is what's been referenced a lot already, which is just synthesizing the evidence. It's definitely not at a stage where you can just ask a chatbot, summarize the evidence for me, and you'll get a good reply. You'll get a bad reply, but you'll get a confident reply that maybe tricks you into thinking it's a good reply. And I think that's because even in the best scenario, the AI isn't doing evidence synthesis, it's summarizing things. And so, say you avoid all the risks, say all of the studies are real, none of those fake citations, say it finds all of the relevant studies and it doesn't introduce bias into the approach by missing a particular demographic or geographic region. Say even when it finds the right studies, it takes the information from the right part of the study, which we know often is a challenge where it maybe takes a finding from the aims of the study and communicates it as a conclusion of the study. But say it does all of those things right, it still doesn't necessarily give you a good result because what it does is it summarizes the findings rather than synthesizing them. So when we go through a systematic process, we might systematically analyze the differential impacts between contexts or between delivery organizations. We might get really good implementation data by running meta-regressions or meta-analysis that can make comparisons. And we might find additional value over and above the conclusions that authors draw. So you have lots of situations in education where you have underpowered studies and 10 separate authors may conclude a null impact, but when you run a meta-analysis, you see a really secure pattern and positive impact in the data. When you give those studies to AI at the moment, unless you give it a really structured process, it will really confidently tell you no evidence of impact because it's seen that written 10 separate times by 10 separate authors. And so our real learning has been around how we direct the AI to the structured parts of the review process. And I think we're seeing areas where there's real promise. So this is where I move into less pessimism mode and more in the kind of the positive AI people I have flooding my LinkedIn mode. And we think it's pretty good at searching and screening. We're beginning to pilot data extraction, and the key point there is it's really heterogeneous. So there are things that AI is good at extracting data from studies from, and there are things that it is bad at extracting data from studies on. Also, education is different. So a lot of these tools have been benchmarked on medical studies that have better reporting structure than we do in education. So we should always be cautious about some of the wider benchmarking that may not be appropriate to education. But all of this feeds into an infrastructure. And I think one of the really important points is around use. So what we're trying to do is make sure that studies feed into a reusable infrastructure so that they're not just contributing to one static PDF or one static output. And then the final key message from our approach is off the shelf really rarely works. So we know there are lots of products marketed at doing your systematic review process for you, even in the bits that we found to be successful. So I think screening and searching is where we found the most success. It takes us on average 2 weeks to develop a prompt that has enough precision and accuracy. So it isn't just asking AI to do it. There is a skill in developing, iterating, testing, and validating the prompts that you do. And that means that there's always going to be trade-offs about when it's useful to use AI and when it's useful to use a traditional review method. It's a very small evidence base. There's no point developing an
promise, but systematic thinking as well around, just what does an approach actually look like that would work here. So I'd like to move to Srihari now, and I'd like to ask you about a slightly different perspective on this, which is more around evidence uptake. So I'd love to hear about your experience in the use of AI for evidence uptake. What you've found that to be so far, and what your takeaways are for the promise, but also the challenges within this area.
Sure, thank you. I think I can resonate a lot with what John was also sharing. Let me give the case studies there in the report, but just to give a sense of what we are trying to, just to give a sense of a meeting making, let me just give a sense of what we are actually trying to do here. So in India, Dream a Dream, we don't have a name for the product we are actually having. So we are piloting something called, let me be very explicit, like a Gen AI supported research policy lab and a collaborative data ecosystem. And the intention is to bridge evidence and policy on social emotional well-being or social emotional learning, which is a core area of the education domain that many of us are actually working. What we realized is that while we wanted to use AI or these dashboards to really understand how evidence synthesis can lead to some uptake in policy, what we also realized is that there's a huge gap, that there is a large volume of evidences and meaningful uptake. Conversations are actually into two different spectrums. So how do we bridge that was the question that we were actually trying to explore even before we wanted to look at what a dashboard looks like or how AI can actually help us to synthesize some of the evidences. So instead of beginning with AI as a tool, what we begin to design is a infrastructure, and what we call it as the relational infrastructure. So at the core, we have this interactive dashboard. We have multiple streams of data, for example, the insights and data from the OECD social emotional skills, the large scale data that we collected as part of Life Skills Collaborative, around 500,000 of data from different states in India. We have a lot of insights from the collaborations that we have with Brookings on system level studies, etc. So we have this situating at the center. And on the top, we have this LLM interface where policymakers and others can actually ask questions, like, the usual way how even a ChatGPT works. Like, they just have to ask, what pattern do you see in teacher well-being? Can you give us a difference between a gender difference between some social emotional skills? What is the global evidences and what are some of the local evidences looks like? So it lowered a lot of entry barriers for evidences. So like as a researcher, I would say, like, we don't need to know what a data means, what is a variable means, what are some of the statistical syntaxes. So there is a lot of entry barriers to evidences were actually being lowered a lot. But one of our insight is that lowering access did not automatically create an uptake. Just because we have this chatbot or these questions that in a very simple way, people can ask, does it mean that there is any uptake on the evidences? That's where we started thinking we need to have a facilitated space to be created around this AI interface and what we call it as a research, practice, policy collaboration. So we are in this collaboration, what we are trying to do is AI is not treated as an answer engine or a ask me anything kind of thing. It is we position this AI-enabled dashboard as a conversation starter. I think one of our insight is basically that when we position the interface as a conversation starter, there's a huge uptake in terms of how we can actually use evidences, because there are quite often evidences are sometimes which is always been delivered. It's not even co-interpreted many times. So the mindset of people or the policymakers thinking that some of these are going to give us some synthesis and that's been delivered, to really shifting the way we look into it, basically a co-creation, meaning making together, etc., really changing the way we're actually looking at. Second, I would say something that I think the previous speaker was also talking about. What we realized is that a lot of summarizing this synthesis, the the synthesis that we are actually getting is a very flattened nuances. Like, for example, especially data like well-being, mental health, the high-risk data or sensitive data is always being flattened by AI when they are actually summarizing. So we need to really think about how do we actually embed a human in loop review so that the AI generated synthesis could be used for policy discussion. So we have this, we do not, the AI, that interface is not actually the authority in the sense like, those generated synthesis could be just being used, but how do we actually make meaning, and how do human interactions and conversation can really make this the human judgment, the contextual knowledge, the moral responsibilities accounted into this. So I would say the accountability sits with people, not with the system. And finally, I would say the another insight we were actually sitting with is that AI is not just helping us. It's not about the speed in which we are actually able to get some synthesis of the evidences. It also serves as a boundary object, like the borrowing the boundary object theory from sociology of science, like how a shared reference point is actually used for collective interpretations, because every actor in the system or in the collaboration can look at the output. They can actually bring their own perspective and remain in the conversations on a boundary object or without fully agreeing to it. So there is something to discuss around, and AI dashboards and this platform really act in that way. So I would conclude by saying the early insight for us, we have yet to launch it. The platform strengthen evidence uptake when it's supported with a collective sense making, not when it is attempted to automate synthesis or decision making. Like, oh, I got this insights. Can I use it for my policy framing? Can I use this synthesis for as a policy action? Not in that way, but how do we make collective sense making is what we understood. And one last question I always get is like, how do we measure the success of this platform? And what we realized is that the success of a platform is not just by how much of the synthesis can be created, but the quality of cross actors or the stakeholders engage into evidence conversations. And even the what we are placing or the offering, what we are actually looking at is like, these platforms, these ecosystems should be locally grounded. It should be a collaborative ecosystem, so that meeting, it supports people to think together, question together, interpret evidence together. That's a human value, right? Like, that should be the uphold that when we are actually looking into, and that's what we have learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shrihar. There's a lot of really interesting insight from that. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I know we want to have time for questions at the end as well. I would like to bring Deborah into the panel, and then I have one quick question for all the panelists. So let's spend another maybe 3-4 minutes on the panel, but then we'll move to questions. So Deborah, can I ask you, which uses should not be automated or AI assisted in your view? And what would you need before you trust AI outputs to be shaping policy and practice decisions?
Sure. So in terms of trust, I think that the same standards that apply for research in general apply here. So replicability, as was mentioned earlier, is a big issue, but also transparency, ethical integrity. But in terms of what we should not do, I think I would talk about a few different buckets here. One would be AI is not good with normative judgment or priority setting, meaning that's a human task. That's something that humans should be doing. So we should decide what questions matter. We should decide what trade-offs are acceptable, what recommendations should be. AI can be a tool in that, but we absolutely make the decisions there. Then second is around the quality appraisal and the interpretation piece. AI can help surface information, but it's not reliable as a judge of methodological quality. It's not good when you're looking across studies to do that synthesis piece that John talked about earlier. It's summarizing. And then third would be the high stakes translation into decision, right? Those fully automated policy briefs or recommendations or what to do answers. Those are things that should be not just either human in the loop or humans in the loops, if it's that iterative, but also it's just an inherently human task that we're the ones making the decisions about how all of this gets translated into policy and practice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so we are going to move into the Q&A in just a second, but before we do, if I can ask the panelists to give just one-line answers to this one. So what is one practical action that you would want funders or evidence intermediaries to take this year to ensure that AI is strengthening local evidence ecosystems rather than weakening them and exacerbating bias? So I'll start with John, please. One practical action.
Thanks. And I think this goes to one of the questions in the chat, actually. My practical action would be collaborate and coordinate. I mean, this is an area where we all are looking for the same things and actually co-investing in things like automated data extraction and collaborating is the real time saver. It would be silly to all go off and build our own separate evidence infrastructures, and just want to give a shout out to a couple of initiatives there. So the evidence synthesis infrastructure collaboration, or ESIC, the METIUS project, and I think particularly in education, the Jacobs synthesis ready repository work is really aiming to build collaborative infrastructure in this space.
Thank you so much, John. Srihari?
I can be very quick. I think the whole approach is basically the whole success depends on the collective sense making. So I would say like how much we invest on the locally governed stewardship of the people that who are actually looking at the data, who owns data, who is actually governing this data, etc. Before even investing in terms of what kind of infrastructure facilities we need, I would say that's something I would recommend.
Fantastic. Deborah?
So I would say, at least in terms of the strengthening evidence ecosystems and in terms of equity, AI can't see what it can't use what it can't see. So I think the making sure that local knowledge is represented and that contexts and LMICs are represented in training data and the knowledge that's being used is really important. In the paper, we make a point around digital object identifiers, DOIs, and making sure that local research has them so that it's findable. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you so much for that panel. There was some incredibly interesting insights coming out from that. And now we've got a little bit of time for Q&A, and we've had some really interesting questions coming through into the chat. So in the interests of time, I'll just read some of these questions out and direct them to panelists and the discussant. So I think I might just start with a question from Natasha Jamarkin on the use of data sources for developing the report on which AI was run. So the question is, it was mentioned at the outset that AI was used in the development of the report. Is it possible to speak about what data sources were used for developing the report on which AI was run? So Deborah, could I ask you to speak to that?
Sure. So we developed Boolean search strings that we use to search for a seed set of sources that we thought were within scope. And then we ran those through AI using deep research tools to actually get additional sources. And then we also used it for a first draft of the paper, which the end result ended up looking very different than that first draft. So that I have more to say on that at another time. But yeah, so we used it primarily to search for sources and then to help us with some initial ideas around synthesis.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, and then we have a question from Lucas Sempen. He would love to connect on more technical things. So for example, what is EEF doing for data extraction? And I think we've had a few other questions that are relevant for EEF as well. So can I bring you in, John, to answer some of these questions? So the question is, what
Yes.
is EEF doing for data extraction?
Yeah, so on data extraction, we're working with the team at Epi Reviewer on piloting using large language models to test different bits of data extraction. So we've done, and as I said when I was speaking, at the moment it's very heterogeneous. So I don't think we're going to get to a point where we can say all data extraction can just be done by AI, but I think we'll increasingly get to a bit where there are certain bits of classification that can be done by AI. And I think one of the interesting things we're picking up there is where natural language associations lead to biases. So one of the really interesting things we see is when we try and get AI to classify which topic area a study is in. So is it to do with feedback? Is it to do with peer tutoring? There are some it's really good at identifying. One of the ones it was really bad at identifying was parental engagement strategies. And we think that's because there is a natural language association between children and parents. So it was saying any study that includes children is a parental engagement study, even though actually anyone working in education research sees that as a really distinct intervention. So whether it's code by code or in broad category areas, what we're trying to do is validate. And the thing that we're really lucky with at EEF is we have 5,000 human coded studies. So what we're able to do is run data extraction by machines and then compare that against the human extracted data. Of course, humans make mistakes as well. So that human data is also not perfect, but it's a really useful way of validating.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think that's just one question from me now, actually, just to follow up. And maybe Srihari, I can bring you in here. And I suppose what I'm wondering is if you were advising a Ministry of Education in a LMIC on how to use AI to better understand what the evidence says and what it means for their context, how would you advise them to do that in a responsible way? Can I bring you in, Srihari, on this one?
We've lost Srihari, so.
Okay, no problem. Maybe I could ask Dr. Molina to come in on this one. Dr. Ezequiel Molina? Yeah.
Sorry,
the question-
sorry. I didn't realize you were asking me. Could you
No
repeat
problem.
the question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my question is, if there's a Ministry of Education in a LMIC that is thinking about using AI for understanding the evidence as it relates to their context, how would you advise them to do that in a responsible way?
So I think like the actual answer, I think we will have to go specifically to what they are looking for. Usually, governments don't really have departments that do evidence review, especially in L6, and they rely on on 3IE or other institutions. So I would start from understanding what is their goal, and then think about the process, or think about how to help them figure out with whom they can work that could use AI or not. I think that's just a tool, no. But the most important is that they know how to do evidence synthesis. So I will be focused mostly on that.
Okay.
Madiha,
Yeah.
I'll jump in here as well, just quickly on that, that I think because most ministries aren't really doing that work directly, they're procuring it. I think having policies around governance of AI and expectations for partners or others that they're working with is going to be really important for ministries of education in the next period.
Fantastic. So I think that concludes the Q&A. Thank you so much for everyone's questions and to the panel and discussant for your insights on this. I'll pass back to Deborah now to close.
Yeah, so thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Just a few final points. As I mentioned, there is a training that we'll be doing that'll get into some of the nitty-gritty on this topic next week. We'll put the link for that in the chat. I know some of you were having trouble accessing the paper. We will resolve that. I think some of that may be a browser issue. We'll look into it. And we'll follow up with an email after this session to make sure that you all are able to get a hold of the paper. And then I just wanted to thank our panelists, everyone who's been a part of this paper. This has been a group effort, and so I'm really thankful for all of the great expertise here today, and thank you so much for coming. Take care, everyone.
So just confirming that some people have joined now. The session is now over. So please feel free to